Canada's national passenger rail network operates from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean, connecting 8 of the country's 10 provinces. Taking over service from Canadian National and Canadian Pacific in 1978, the network has changed dramatically, reflecting the decline of passenger rail travel across the country. Combined with Amtrak services from the United States, the network links various cities and small towns across the country, with a variety of commuter, intercity, and long-distance routes. But how has the network changed from the daily cross-country system of 1978 to the lines that remain today? I'm Zach with Vanish Underground, and let's find out. Before we start, a couple notes on our legend. We've broken down the country into 3 sections: Eastern Canada, Ontario and Quebec, and Western Canada. In the coming weeks, we'll go more in depth into each of these sections, showcasing the specific routes and their frequencies. Once these videos are released, you can access them by clicking the button in the top right corner of this video. Additionally, we're only displaying major stations on the network in order to give a broad overview of the system. You can view our entire selection criteria in the description box of this video. With that being said, let's begin our journey in 1977. That year, VIA Rail was formed, modeling off of the United States' creation of Amtrak 6 years prior. 1 year later, in April 1978, VIA took over responsibility for CN Rail's passenger services, forming the original backbone of the cross-country network. In October of that year, Canadian Pacific also transferred their passenger services to VIA. At the same time, Amtrak provides service in Southern Ontario, rerouting trains to run through Niagara Falls, New York, bypassing Fort Erie as a result. However, this change was short-lived, as Amtrak service between Detroit and Albany was cancelled in January 1979. In May, VIA began making changes to the network, abandoning some services and improving routing on others. In northern Manitoba, service between Flin Flon and Osborne Lake was withdrawn in May. On Vancouver Island in British Columbia, service was revised to include new stops at Langford and North Cowichan, and expanded to run daily. In northern Quebec, service between Chambord and Dolbeau was discontinued, as well as between Rouen, Noranda, and Sainte-Terre. Service between Quebec City and Edmundston, New Brunswick was also withdrawn around this time. Southern Quebec saw service between Sherbrooke and Montreal through Farnham removed near the end of 1979, which included the cancellation of commuter service along the present-day Candiac line. Service in Northern Ontario was also revised, resulting in a reduction in frequency between Nakina and Sioux Lookout. In Washington State, Amtrak service was extended, with a daily southbound train extending to Portland, Oregon. In the Vancouver area, VIA service to New Westminster and Coquitlam stations were withdrawn, replaced with a new consolidated stop in Port Coquitlam. Amtrak service continued to change into 1980, with the addition of the Schenectady stop in New York State. Additionally, only 6 months after it was introduced, services between Seattle and Portland from Vancouver were also withdrawn. Many smaller routes were discontinued that year, with Ontario seeing service between Hornepayne and Manitouwadge cut, and Saskatchewan seeing service from Saskatoon to Hudson's Bay removed, and the station in Melfort no longer serviced. Further frequency reductions in Ontario saw frequencies reduced between Winnipeg and Sioux Lookout, and Nakina and Sudbury. 1981 saw various services revised in Southern Ontario, with trains between Hamilton and Buffalo being discontinued. In its place, a new Amtrak train began running, filling the gap between Schenectady and Niagara Falls, running through Buffalo, Rochester, and Syracuse. However, on the West Coast, Amtrak service between Vancouver, British Columbia, and Seattle, Washington was discontinued that September due to budget pressures in the United States. At the end of 1981, similar budget pressures affected VIA service in Canada, with a 20% budget cut forcing a dramatic reduction in service. In New Brunswick, service between Moncton and Edmundston was discontinued, as well as service between St. John and Sherbrooke, Quebec, running through Maine. In its place, new service was introduced between St. John and Fredericton, returning passenger rail to the New Brunswick capital after a 19-year absence. In Quebec, trains between Montreal and Saguenay saw service frequency reduced, with services between Quebec City, Rivière-Pierre, and Hervey discontinued. Service along the north shore of the Ottawa River through Gatineau was also discontinued at this time, as well as seasonal service north to Mont-Laurier. Additionally, VIA service through Vaudreuil-Dorion was cancelled, leaving only one route between Ottawa and Montreal. In Ontario, frequency on the line between Ottawa and Sudbury was reduced. Manitoba also saw changes, with daily service being removed between Woboden and Thompson. The station in Swan River was also closed at this time. Direct service between Winnipeg and Saskatoon was also removed, with trains on this route now traveling through Regina. North of Saskatoon, service to Prince Albert also ceased. In Alberta, service between Edmonton and Drumheller was discontinued, and British Columbia saw service between Jasper and Port Coquitlam removed, with VIA trains no longer servicing Abbotsford and Chilliwack. In September 1982, cuts to the VIA Rail network continued, with various commuter services in the Toronto and Montreal area being removed. In Toronto, GO Transit took over service to Stouffville and Barrie, resulting in many intermediate stations on these lines being transferred to their ownership. GO opted not to take over service between Toronto and Havelock, however, resulting in this route being discontinued in September. In the Montreal area, service to Sherbrooke was withdrawn at the same time, resulting in intermediate stations on the present-day Mont-Saint-Hilaire line being closed. In October, Amtrak began operating a new route into Canada, continuing west from Sarnia, Ontario to Chicago, Illinois, and servicing various cities in Michigan. A new station opened in Mississauga, Ontario in 1983, just outside of Toronto. The following year, service in Saskatchewan was revised, with trains between Regina and Saskatoon being removed and replaced once again by direct service between Saskatoon and Winnipeg. Additionally, with the election of a new federal government, some services that had been cut 3 years prior began to be restored, with service between Moncton, New Brunswick and Edmundston restored on a reduced schedule. Service restorations continued into 1985, with daily service between St. John, New Brunswick and Saint-Hyacinthe, Quebec resuming, replacing service to Fredericton. In Ontario, service between Toronto and Havelock resumed, and service between Ottawa and Sudbury was once again increased to run daily. Northern Ontario, however, saw service between Thunder Bay and Sioux Lookout removed in November of that year. Direct service in Alberta between Calgary and Edmonton through Red Deer also ended in 1985, removing direct trains between the biggest cities in the province. In British Columbia, service resumed to Abbotsford and Chilliwack, restoring daily service between Edmonton and Port Coquitlam. 1986 saw some smaller-scale closures on the network in the Toronto area, with stations in Mississauga and Richmond Hill being closed. In the north end of the province, service between Nakina and Hearst also ceased. 1987 saw a bridge collapse in Quebec suspend service between Quebec City and Trois-Rivières. Additionally, poor track conditions in Vermont saw Amtrak service between Montreal and Springfield, Massachusetts suspended, cutting off direct trains between Montreal and Washington, D.C. Service revision continued in the U.S. in 1988, with an additional Amtrak stop added in Hammond, Indiana. Service between Quebec City and Trois-Rivières was restored in 1989 as the bridge was rebuilt, as well as Amtrak service between Montreal and Washington, D.C. However, routing for this service was revised, servicing new stops in New London, Connecticut and Amherst, Massachusetts. Then came 1990. The federal government ordered a 50% reduction in passenger service, which cut VIA's budget from $600 million annually to $350 million. This resulted in numerous VIA Rail services being discontinued across the network, and frequencies being reduced on many of the surviving routes. In Nova Scotia, service to Yarmouth and Sydney was withdrawn, while New Brunswick saw service between Moncton and Edmundston withdrawn once again. Frequencies on the remaining routes were reduced, with daily service no longer being offered. In Quebec, service on the north shore of the St. Lawrence River through Laval and Trois-Rivières was removed, with services being consolidated on the south side of the St. Lawrence River. Ontario saw service between Toronto and Havelock once again removed, as well as service between Toronto and Kapuskasing. As well, the line between Ottawa and Sudbury was closed at this time. In the west, service on the southern transcontinental route through Regina, Saskatchewan and Calgary, Alberta was abandoned, leaving these two large cities with no passenger rail service. Frequencies on the northern transcontinental route were reduced at the same time, with daily service no longer being offered. As a small victory, however, a new station opened that year in Yonkers, New York, servicing Amtrak trains running to and from New York City. In 1992, the three stations in the Hamilton and Burlington area of Ontario were consolidated, resulting in a new station opening in Burlington at the present-day Aldershot GO station. This new stop helped to improve customer service and reduce staffing costs in the area. At the end of 1994, VIA service between Moncton, New Brunswick and Saint-Hyacinthe, Quebec was discontinued, removing the last VIA route running through the United States. This also left Sherbrooke, Quebec and Saint John, New Brunswick with no passenger rail service, a contentious issue to this day. In 1995, Amtrak service between Montreal and Washington, D.C. was withdrawn due to budget pressures in the United States. While Amtrak operates a variation of this service today, trains no longer cross the Canada-US border, ending 20 kilometers south in St. Albans, Vermont. Funding has been spent in recent years to once again extend this service to Montreal, with service expected to resume in the next 2 years. On the West Coast, Amtrak restarted trains between Vancouver and Seattle in May 1995, with daily service in each direction. 1996 saw a few more station closures in Ontario, with trains between Sudbury and Toronto being rerouted to a different line. This resulted in VIA Rail no longer servicing stations in Barrie, Newmarket, and Orillia. In Northern Ontario, VIA service between Cochrane and Sainte-Terre, Quebec was also suspended due to speed restriction imposed on the tracks. British Columbia saw changes in 1999, with Port Coquitlam Station being closed. The following year, service in the area was further revised to operate in a one-way loop, with trains servicing Chilliwack and Abbotsford into Vancouver, and train service restarting to Mission on eastbound trips. On the East Coast, a new tourist train ran once a week to Sydney, Nova Scotia. In 2001, the station in Mississauga, Ontario was once again reopened. However, Hammond, Indiana was once again removed from the Amtrak line to Chicago. Northern Manitoba saw some changes in 2003, with service between Lynn Lake and the Pas being cut back to Pukatawagan. More service reductions were undertaken in 2004. In Nova Scotia, the once weekly train to Sydney was discontinued. Amtrak also decided to discontinue service between Chicago and Sarnia due to extensive border crossing delays in the aftermath of the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Service on this line was replaced in the United States only, with no cross-border transit service being offered between Port Huron and Sarnia. 2 years later, in 2006, service in northern Manitoba between Pukatawagan and the Pas was transferred to a private operator and no longer appeared on the VIA Rail timetables. Few changes were made to the network for the rest of the decade, until 2009, when Amtrak service was once again extended south from Seattle, Washington to Portland, Oregon. In 2011, poor track conditions resulted in the suspension of service on Vancouver Island, British Columbia, ceasing daily service between Victoria and Courtenay. 2 years later, a similar predicament forced the suspension of service in Quebec between Matapédia and Gaspé. In 2014, service in Quebec was further revised in the Quebec City area, with trains from the east now servicing stations within the city itself. The following year, the station in Repentigny, Quebec was closed due to safety reasons, removing VIA service from this Montreal suburb. 2017 saw flooding in northern Manitoba heavily damage the tracks between Gillam and Churchill, effectively isolating this community with no road access. Repairs on the line were conducted over the following year, with service to Churchill resuming at the end of 2018. This brings us to the VIA Rail network that we know today. Thanks for watching. We hope you enjoyed this video and learned something new about how the VIA Rail network came to be. If you have any questions or we got anything wrong, please leave us a comment down below. Feel free to leave a like if you want to see more, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our upcoming in-depth videos on the VIA Rail network evolution. And finally, as for us here, we'll be vanishing underground until the next one.